Hope you're doing well today. We're going to be doing another rendition of Zephyr 101. At this week's request, this actually comes from the community. One of the community members was curious, hey, I'm new to Zephyr, new to NCS actually. I'm a Nordic customer that was switching from their previous SDK to Zephyr. So here we are. So let's figure out the differences, and I'll just put my little tidbits here and there to help out with anybody who's maybe confused about the differences between the two. But really, what we're really going to be talking about is like how they work together and how one does not work without the other. So we'll jump in. We'll go from there. Wrong one. All right. If you haven't already, click that subscribe button, hit that bell icon, and hit the thumbs up. Actually, the bell icon probably would have helped you today. For some reason, my mailing list did not go out until about 10 minutes ago. So if you're subscribed on YouTube, you'll definitely get the notifications that these live streams are happening. They happen every week, usually Tuesday or Wednesday, so around the same time. So from Brian, and thank you, Brian, for your contribution. If you like to support the channel, I'll just add this plug. If you'd like to support the channel, I actually put some links in the description below. Helps keep this content coming and also helps support the open source efforts that I do here at Circuit Dojo. Almost everything I produce is all open source and provided to the community, either as Apache 2 or something similar. So if you like to support the channel, check it out below. And thanks everybody for being here. So yeah, his question is video demystifying the differences between Nordic Fork and vanilla Zephyr. So we're going to be talking about that. Some of the biggest differences we'll be talking about, we'll explore the interdependent relationship. So NCS is definitely dependent on Zephyr, not the other way around, and things to look out for. So just some tips and tricks as we go. Kind of like what I said before. NRF Connect SDK, short NCS for short, is an external Zephyr dependency. So it's developed by Nordic Semiconductor, and it's to support their chips. So so this is where things diverge, and this is probably why they created it, is that there are some certain proprietary things that Nordic does that maybe they don't want to give a permissive Apache 2 license. It's just the general idea, and we'll dive into the individual pieces here, but that's the big thing that we'll be harping on here. They've been supporting and developing on NCS since the release of the NRF 9160. So they had their own SDK for a while. It's kind of bare metal, and they were supporting that for a long time up through the NRF 52 device launches. And then there was enough traction in the community and within Nordic themselves, so that actually there were certain developers that were already programming and using Zephyr that they convinced themselves enough to make the switch and actually fully support Zephyr and drop all other support for all their other existing SDKs. So this has been happening since the NRF 9160, since it is a newer chip with a little bit more advanced features. It has the dual core design, the M33 design. So that's something that I think it made sense for them to make that switch to that point. Plus, the cool thing is there's already a lot of support in Zephyr, and we'll go over that for the other Nordic chips that have already been released and out there in the open. NCS does not work without Zephyr, so you can't have NCS on its own and it'd be considered Zephyr. It does actually pull in Zephyr when you're using NCS, so it's an important distinction. So the difference here between a kind of like a standard vanilla versus Nordic is Nordic does maintain their own fork. So this means that when you're pulling NCS, they do pull the Nordic fork of Zephyr. This might make you think, okay, well, their Zephyr version is really different, or there's something wrong or something that you're going to be missing out on, but that's not necessarily the case. What they're doing is they're putting stakes in the ground, saying, okay, this is our working version for this version of NCS. It has a certain amount of features that maybe haven't made it to mainline vanilla Zephyr yet. So what they're doing is just they're testing and refining those, And at the same time, they're also working on actually building them back into vanilla Zephyr in many cases. So they're not only improving kind of the experience of NCS, but they're actually a lot of that work is going back into Zephyr, and you can see those improvements go to benefit everyone. So if you actually look in the Zephyr repo, you can often see tons of Nordic people doing a lot of the hard grinding work of looking through PRs. And I know Marty Bolivar is one of those people, but I know a lot of the Nordic engineers are actually working directly on that repository. So they're moving code in between the two, the fork and the mainline branch of Zephyr. So they're working on Zephyr, vanilla Zephyr. But at the same time, they also have to support all these new features and new functionalities for their newer chips. And some of that stuff doesn't translate very well. It doesn't, and some of it they don't want to put in mainline Zephyr for whatever reason that they have. One of the biggest differences between the two is if you open NCS and you actually open the repo, check out the license file, it is BSD5 clause. So we'll get into that in a second. And vanilla Zephyr is Apache 2. Apache 2 basically it gives you more permission. It's kind of more permissive license, so you can kind of use it for whatever you want, which is really nice. The NCS version, while it is permissive, there are some things there you got to keep in mind, and I definitely recommend, I'm not a lawyer, so definitely recommend reading that license to understand a little bit more what they're saying. But any code, so for that BSD variant, so the biggest thing that you have to take away from here is that any code they use in NCS, so whether it's their samples, their application code, their libraries, things like that, it needs to be used with Nordic specific product. So if you're, like, for instance, if you use their, they have a library for sending application events. That application event library you can only use with Nordic parts. That's just the sad truth of it. So when you are building your application, one of the main advantages of Zephyr is that you can, like, I've done a previous talk on this where you can actually take two pieces of hardware, two different processors, two different vendors, and you can essentially compile and run the same code on two different devices. So it could be two different architectures. So that's one thing you have to keep in mind is if you're aiming to be able to maybe switch to a different architecture or chip in the future, that's one thing you have to just bear in mind is if you are using any of Nordic's code, just use it sparingly. But a lot of it is great, and I'm a Nordic fanboy. I'm never gonna encourage anybody to switch away from it because every chip that I've used and developed with and put into production has been great. So, but your mileage may vary. So the thing is going back to that, most of Nordic's code is Nordic specific, and it's meant for their specific devices. And I was kind of mentioning this earlier, is when they develop their code, it's something that's maybe proprietary to that specific device. So that's not something that's going to be put into mainline because of the licensing requirements. That's just the plain, if someone all of a sudden rips off their chip or creates their own thing and then just like uses all their software, that doesn't really help Nordic in the end. While they do, like I said, they do give back to the Zephyr community. They're improving the Zephyr vanilla branch significantly. So they are giving back. It's not like they're just taking. So, but you can't use the NCS code in a, so yeah, the first bullet is just basically me saying, hey, you can't use the NCS code with that BSD license in a vanilla Zephyr context. So unless you're using a Nordic part. That's just one thing that's important there. They do have some things in that license as well, like you can't reverse engineer things, but definitely check out that license because I am not a lawyer. So let's talk about the West YAML file. This is kind of like the difference between the two, I guess you could say. If you, they're included in the same way in your project. So if you target vanilla Zephyr or if you target NCS, they're imported the same way. Obviously, NCS will actually pull in its own version of Zephyr, and by including the West YAML file in NCS, will pull in all the dependencies that's required by NCS. So if you can think of it as like a hierarchy of manifest files, if you have a project, you can just include Zephyr, and that's just like your first include. Or you can include NCS, which recursively will pull all the dependencies in NCS for your project. So it is pulling a version of Zephyr. It is pulling anything else that has. So a lot of these things require libraries like embed TLS, things, CJSON, things like that. So that stuff gets pulled in as per the West YAML files, depending on what's required. So I know Nordic pulls in certain libraries for NCS, whereas it's not included in Zephyr. So just something to keep in mind. Here is the, if you're using NCS, this is just an example. It's a bit of an old example using an old version of NCS, but it's the same thing. All you have to do is change the version number. So we're setting the remotes, and then we're including the SDK. So, and that's all it does. And then on the inside, here's the inside of the West YAML in NCS itself. It's actually pulling Zephyr. One thing you don't see is the links up above, but the Git links, the Git URL. So that's just one thing. It's pulling an older version of Zephyr because it's an old version of NCS. So all of that is happening behind the scenes where you're not explicitly calling out what version of Zephyr you want. This is important because, like I said, they put the flag in the ground and say, this is the version of Zephyr that I want to use, and it's compatible with this version of NCS. So you can't really define what version of Zephyr you want. You just need to wait to get to the point where NCS is using the version of Zephyr you want, if that makes sense. And then this is actually using the vanilla. So this is a West YAML file that I was using, and it was just pulling in the vanilla Zephyr. And this was using an STM32, I think, at the time. So as you see, I'm just pulling in the direct repository for Zephyr and just referencing the version number. This version is whatever, 3 or 4 months old now. So I will reiterate again, but NCS will pull in a specific version of Nordic's fork, and the fork may be older. So that's one thing you have to keep in mind is you might get a version 2.3 of NCS tomorrow, but it might be using an older version of Zephyr. They have been increasing their release schedules now that they've kind of gotten the ball rolling a little bit, and you will get kind of most of the release features, but sometimes people have to wait to get the I know in the past I've talked to people where they've had difficulty getting the latest version of OpenThread in NCS. So I know sometimes it requires a little patience, sometimes it requires actually going to the NCS repo and pulling like the latest commit versus waiting for a release tag. So that's unfortunately a game you kind of have to play a little bit, but for the most part, I've never really had to do that unless there are bug fixes or kind of critical bugs that I've found in the projects, but that's less and less these days. I know I've done it in the past where it's like, this isn't working. Specifically when I've set up the HCI interface between the NRF52 and NRF91, there were some crazy bugs there, and that did require some finagling and actually cherry picking which hash commit to actually pull into the project. So something to keep in mind as you journey into NCS and Zephyr itself. So vanilla Zephyr does support many NRF parts long before Nordic came along and actually considered it their SDK of choice. The NRF 51 and 52 series are specifically supported, community supported. So that's just something that you can do. And I've seen other people use the NRF 52 series without NCS without problems. So it is very nice if you don't really feel like pulling in NCS itself. Now, the only thing that's a bummer is that depending on your, I guess your opinion, is that the newer, more advanced versions, so the NRF 53 and the NRF 91 are only supported in NCS. One thing that NCS does that Nordic or the Zephyr repo doesn't really provide is a nice some examples or full applications. So fully developed applications end to end that you can kind of use and take and use for your own purposes. This includes an asset tracker and serial LTE modem sample or examples. So those are fully built out for you to use right off the shelf if you want to. Or you can just use them as kind of references or kind of figure out what you want to do with your own project. It's a little bit different than a sample. Samples are usually kind of targeted to a specific piece of functionality. So if you're for instance, like the NRF 9160 has an AT client sample, which is only focused on AT client only. So it basically allows you to connect the serial, pipe AT commands over serial, and it will issue them to the modem firmware. So those are two distinctions there. Nordic, along the same vein, Nordic also provides extra drivers and peripherals that are specific. So not surprising, parts like the new NRF 7002, NRF 91, and the NRF 53 obviously get new special treatment here. They're not going to be put in vanilla Zephyr, and they do. So the one thing here is the structure. If you look at NCS versus Zephyr, they're very similar. They're going to have the same setup, the same boards folder, the same lib folder. It's going to look very similar, and that's a great thing because everything in Zephyr is kept consistent, and you can, if you're looking for a specific file or functionality or module, it's going to be where you expect it to be. So that's the nice thing about Zephyr and NCS. Here are some kind of proprietary driver support that they include in there in NCS that you're not going to be able to get in vanilla Zephyr. A lot of it is related to NRF 91, and as they build out their NRF 53 and the NRF 7002, you might see a little bit more. I know there's the Wi-Fi library I left off here, but NRF xlib, DTime, LTE, LC, or link control, command parser for the NRF 9160. So these are all things that are included in NCS that are not in vanilla Zephyr, and you just got to keep that in mind. And then here are all the samples. Because I was mentioning these samples before, you can check out, there's just a whole bunch of different, more product-specific samples. Some of these are like the app event manager. That's one thing, is like, it could have been put into vanilla Zephyr, or they could have kind of shared that technology with everyone else. It's very platform agnostic, but you have anything specific to the NRF 91 and that NRF 9160 folder. In general, just samples that Nordic has built to help people get their peripherals and functionality working on a Nordic specific chip. So in similar fashion to vanilla Zephyr, NCS includes all these samples. So I'm not going to belabor the point, but you can see the pattern here, why they've created NCS in the first place and why they might have a separate fork of vanilla Zephyr. But in reality, most of that stuff goes back into vanilla Zephyr, and then they keep their kind of proprietary, their stuff that they don't want to be permissively licensed inside NCS. So in conclusion, the NCS is just a subset of Zephyr, and you can't use it without vanilla Zephyr, no matter what. While Zephyr is standalone, NCS, it cannot stand alone. You need some type of version of Zephyr underneath. So that's how it works. Just keep in mind the licensing. I think that's the biggest takeaway here. So if you take away anything from this talk, just keep in mind of the licensing, and you're going to get better support in NCS for anything that's newer. The NRF 91, NRF 7002, NRF 53, even the NRF 52 series, you're going to get a little bit better support, because that's where Nordic is going to be, they're going to be laser focused on making sure it's reliable for you, versus community support, where it's just community. It's just, it's somebody on the weekend coding away on a specific driver, or just trying to get functionality working, and it might not be 100% bulletproof, or it might not be feature complete. So just something to keep in mind. I know there's a lot of people in the Rust community that are basically, they're on their own. It's a community support type of thing where They've developed bindings for the NRFX lib and things like that, so people can use the NRF 91 on embedded Rust, things like that. So in this case, Nordic supports Zephyr, supports their Connect SDK, and it'll work for you if you are using Nordic parts. So, and that's it for today. So I'm losing my voice here. And I don't know if there's any questions, but you get the idea, hopefully. And if you didn't, please leave a message below and let me know your thoughts, or maybe there's something that you want me to dive into further. I'd love to share a little bit more detail about this stuff, but I hope that answers your question, Brian. And if you haven't already, check out jaredwolf.com, subscribe to the mailing list, and you'll get emails hopefully a little bit earlier than today. Usually I send it about an hour earlier just to let people know what's going on. And yeah, I really appreciate y'all being here. Toria, thanks for another great video. Glad I got to catch you live this time. Really learned a lot from your series. That's great. Awesome. All right. Yeah, Brian. Excellent. Thank you. Okay. I'm glad that helped. And if it didn't, please let me know. But if you guys have any suggestions for the next video, I'm open ears and open eyes. I have a list of topics that I'd love to cover on the next live stream. So, but please keep them coming because they are inspiration for coming videos and maybe some more. I'm thinking about doing maybe some kind of live development. I gotta figure out kind of the flow of something like that. But I love to kind of build something live and hopefully give some people kind of the way I think about when I'm building things in Zephyr. But let me know if that sounds interesting. And yeah, we'll see you next week. And thanks for being here and have a good one.